Hey there, Silver Recaps here. Watch out. The story begins with a couple named Jane and Richard. Richard is married and Jane lives next door to him. The two are in a secret relationship and spend time together in private. Before they leave, the pilot gives them peyote, a type of local drug. Richard and Jane have come here to enjoy their weekend together, spending intimate moments with each other. The next morning, Jane wakes up and looks for something to drink in the fridge, but she doesn't find much, so she settles for water. As she's drinking, she suddenly notices two men standing in front of her, staring at her strangely. Jane immediately calls out to Richard. When Richard sees them, he looks disappointed. These two men are actually his friends, Stan and Dimmy. Richard introduces them to Jane. As night falls, they all start partying. During the party, Stan and Dimmy can't help but notice Jane's body. Then, their attention shifts to the peyote. Richard tells them that it's a powerful drug that could even kill them. He then asks Jane to hide it from them. Jane takes the peyote and hides it inside her locket before returning to the party. She starts dancing, and soon, Stan joins her. From the moment he saw Jane, he had wanted her. He was completely taken by her at first sight. They continue to enjoy the night, and morning arrives. Jane steps outside, and Stan calls out to her. He tells her that Richard has gone to the market for work, and Dimmy is still dealing with his hangover from last night. Stan purposely spills something on Jane's body and begins wiping it off. Meanwhile, Jane is on her phone, but she notices that Stan is staring at her without looking away. Feeling uncomfortable, she leaves, saying that she needs to get ready to go home. Inside, Jane starts changing her clothes when suddenly, Stan enters the room. Seeing him, she immediately tells him to leave, but Stan says, "I wish we had more time together to really get to know each other." Jane bluntly tells him, "I'm not interested in you." Hearing this, Stan gets angry and demands to know why. Jane mockingly tells him that she doesn't like short men. She turns to leave, but Stan, furious at the insult, forcefully grabs her. Just then, Dimmy walks in, but instead of helping, he simply ignores the situation and walks away. Stan then assaults Jane. A while later, Richard returns and notices the tension on their faces. He asks what happened, and Stan casually says that Jane is just a little upset. Richard goes inside to check on Jane. Shaken, she tells him, "Call the helicopter. I need to go home." Then she tells him the truth, that Stan forced himself on her. Richard, instead of supporting her, argues with her over it. Later, Jane regains her senses and looks at Richard. He tells her that everything is fine. Then, he hands her a large amount of money and tells her to forget everything and start a new life. But Jane still insists on going home. Richard refuses, saying, "That's not possible. The helicopter won't be here so soon." Jane grabs the phone and says, "Call it right now, or I'll tell your wife everything." Hearing this, Richard, enraged, slaps her hard. Jane runs out of there as fast as she can, with the three men chasing after her. They all go after her, but Jane manages to get ahead. However, she soon reaches the edge of a cliff where the path ends. The men surround her, urging her not to jump. Richard apologizes to Jane and pretends to call the pilot, telling him to come. He acts as if he is fixing everything, but just as Jane lets her guard down, Richard suddenly pushes her off the cliff. She falls and lands on a broken tree, with a sharp branch piercing through her stomach. Richard coldly states, "I did this to save us all. If she had gone home, we would have spent 15 years in prison, and I won't let that happen." He instructs the others to act as if they know nothing and just say they were out hunting like they do every year. With that, they leave, erasing all evidence of Jane's presence. Meanwhile, Stan and Dimmy prepare their guns. On the other side, Jane's body lies still, covered in ants biting her wounds, yet she is still alive. She gathers her strength and struggles to reach for her lighter. With immense effort, she grabs it and sets fire to the tree branch, piercing her body, burning it enough to free herself. She then climbs down and begins moving forward. At the same time, the three men are approaching her location. Hearing the sound of their vehicle, Jane quickly moves ahead and hides behind a rock. When they arrive and see that Jane is no longer there, they are left in shock. Stan says, "It's not too late. We can still find her and take her to a hospital." Richard, enraged, snaps back, "Say another word and I'll rip your throat out. We are in this mess because of you." They then decide to split up and search for her. Each of them gets in their vehicles and heads downward. By now, night has fallen. As they continue searching, they find traces of Jane's blood and follow the trail until it leads them to a river. But beyond this point, they have no clue where she might have gone. They decide that one of them will stay here, while the other two search in different directions. Stan stays behind while Richard and Dimmy split up to look for her. Meanwhile, Jane is shown in a severely wounded state with the piece of wood still stuck in her body. She suddenly hears the sound of an approaching vehicle. Looking up, she sees someone searching for her. It's Dimmy. She quickly hides until he moves past her. Once he is gone, she comes out. Demi, unaware of her presence, stops to relieve himself. Seeing this as her chance, Jane moves toward him. She picks up his gun and pulls the trigger, but there are no bullets. Demi smirks and says, "Did you really think I'd be stupid enough to keep my gun loaded and invite death?" He then beats Jane and contacts Stan, telling him that he has found her. Stan feels relieved. Demi continues to beat Jane mercilessly and then pushes her into the water. As she struggles, her hand reaches for a knife. The moment Demi pulls her out, she stabs him in the eyes, driving the blade deep into his skull. Demi dies instantly. Jane then takes his vehicle and drives away as fast as she can. She gets far ahead, but soon the gas runs out. With no other option, she gathers supplies and continues on foot. Eventually, she finds a cave and hides inside. Searching through Demi's bag, she takes only the essential items. First, she drinks some beer, then prepares to remove the wooden shard stuck in her stomach. She remembers the peyote she had hidden earlier and decides to use it to numb the pain. After consuming the drug, she pulls out the wooden piece from her body, then heats a beer can over the fire and presses it against her wound to stop the bleeding. Morning arrives and Jane starts having intense hallucinations. She sees visions of Richard killing her, Demi's dead body, and other disturbing images. When she finally regains her senses, she realizes her wound has healed, and she is now ready for revenge. Loading bullets into her gun, she sets out. Meanwhile, Richard arrives and throws a dead animal onto Stan's car, startling him. Richard demands to know where Demi is. Stan tells him that Demi found Jane. Stan then goes to the river to wash his face, but just then, Demi's dead body floats to the surface. Seeing this, Stan panics. Richard immediately understands that Jane is behind this and is now out for revenge. Without hesitation, he stuffs Demi's body with rocks and, with Stan's help, sinks it into the river. As they are about to leave, Richard suddenly punches Stan in the nose, causing it to bleed heavily. He does this out of frustration, blaming Stan for the trouble they are in. Furious, he orders Stan to follow him. They soon reach the location where Jane had abandoned the vehicle. Richard takes out a map and decides they should split up, but Stan disagrees, arguing that they will be safer together. Annoyed by Stan's hesitation, Richard angrily tells him to stop talking nonsense and that they will regroup later. He then leaves alone. Meanwhile, Jane spots them from a distance. She notices something shining. It's Stan looking at his reflection in the car mirror, checking his nose. The reflection is visible from afar. As he leaves, he takes a path through the rocky hills, unaware that Jane is following him. Stan eventually stops to refuel his car. Jane gets into position, takes aim, and fires. The bullet hits Stan's shoulder. She cautiously approaches his vehicle, but he is no longer there. Stan has managed to escape. Jane follows the blood trail, tracking him deeper into the wilderness. Up ahead, Stan removes his sock and ties it around his wound, trying to stop the bleeding before finding a place to hide. Jane keeps following his trail, but soon, the bloodstains disappear, and she loses track of him. As she moves forward, Stan suddenly fires at her. The bullet grazes her ear, leaving her momentarily deafened. She stumbles, but gathers her strength and starts running. Stan fires repeatedly, determined to kill her. Jane, thinking fast, shatters a flashlight lens and scatters the broken glass in his path before hiding. When Stan moves forward, he steps on the sharp glass, wounding his foot. Blood gushes from the deep cuts, but he painfully removes the glass and limps toward his car. He manages to start the vehicle and speeds toward Jane in an attempt to run her over. Jane stands her ground and fires multiple shots at him, but most of them miss. Stan, desperate to kill her, keeps accelerating. Finally, one bullet finds its mark, hitting Stan fatally. He loses control and dies instantly. Jane walks over to his car, takes it, and drives away. Meanwhile, Richard returns to the location and waits for Stan for a long time, but he never shows up. Realizing something is wrong, Richard decides to head back home. Once there, he walks over to the pool, dips his head in the water, and takes a drink. He then goes inside and immediately calls the pilot, instructing him to arrive as soon as possible. Richard then heads to the shower, but as he bathes, he suddenly hears a strange sound. Alert, he checks around the entire house, even stepping outside, but finds nothing. Just as he starts to relax, the television turns on by itself, startling him. As he looks toward the window, his eyes widen. Jane is standing outside, aiming a gun directly at him. Without hesitation, Jane fires, and the bullet strikes Richard in the stomach, wounding him. A gunfight breaks out between them, but Richard seizes an opportunity and manages to escape. Jane enters the house and follows the trail of blood, tracking him down. On the other side, Richard, desperate to stop his bleeding, wraps a plastic cover around his wound. Now, both of them are hunting each other. Richard soon runs out of bullets while Jane keeps searching for him. As she moves forward, her foot suddenly slips and she falls. Taking advantage of the moment, Richard attacks her from behind, pinning her down. He snarls, "You killed both of them and now you're going to kill me too? No one can save you from me now." But Jane fights back. With all her strength, she thrusts her hand into Richard's wound, causing him to collapse in agony. Seizing the moment, she picks up her gun, aims directly at him, and pulls the trigger. The bullet hits its mark, and Richard dies on the spot. Jane delivers justice in her own way, making sure the guilty pay for their crimes.